I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm coming home now, right away. I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm sorry now I ever went away. Every night and day I go to stay. I'm coming home, baby. Coming home, baby, now.
I'm waiting for you.
I'm coming home now, real soon.
They gone.
Coming home, baby, now.
You don't know what I'm going through.
I'm coming home, I know I'm overdue.
Since you went away.
Take me any day now, real soon. I'm coming home. I'm coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm praying every night.
Everything is gonna be fine.
Please come on.
Coming home, baby, now.
I want to feel you hold me tight.
Expect to see me now anytime.
When I'm in your
You're
arms.
in my arms, I'll be fine. I'm coming home. I'm coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm coming every day.
I'm coming home now, yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're so cold.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
And baby, let me hear you say.
I'm coming home, you're hearing what I say.
That you're coming home.
And I never will go. I'm coming home.
Come on home.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm waiting at the door.
They can't hold me back now, no more.
All alone.
I'm racing on, baby, now.
And they say up and down the floor.
Oh, hear me holler, go and hear me roar.
Say you'll be with me.
Gonna be with you forevermore. I'm coming home.
Come on home.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
Oh, baby, say you're coming home.
That's what I say I'm coming home.
Something's wrong.
The road is long, baby, now.
Want to either right or wrong.
I'm coming home and never more to go.
Baby, tell me you.
Baby, I'm for sure coming home. I'm coming home.
Come on home.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
Come on home.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
Come on home.
I'm coming home, baby, now.
Can we get the lights, Keith? Oh, there we go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We'd like to thank Rick D'Amato for putting this together, and as luck would have it, that's me. So tonight, what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a little bit of the pace of what we're going to be doing this evening. We've got an amazing panel of speakers here, and I'm very proud to moderate for them this evening. It's my distinct honor. And each one is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then at the end of the speeches, which is going to be Ken Odell on the very end over there, we're going to collect the note cards, which you should have received upon arriving into the auditorium, these white note cards, which will have the questions on them. And then while I'm speaking, we're going to take the cards. We have more of them if you didn't get any, so I don't know, where'd you do with those, Laura?
Right down.
Oh, they're right down there in case you need one. And then we're going to go ahead and read your questions out loud to the panel here so we can get the answers so everybody can hear the questions and the answers, all right? But first, I was told our Vice Mayor was going to be here, Robert Garcia, but I don't see him. Did he make it tonight? Oh, there you are. I'd like to welcome Mr. Garcia this evening. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate your presence. But first, I would like to make a special introduction to, well, there I am. Well, first of all, a little bit about me, so you know I'm just not some schmuck that walked in off the street. I think the reason that I was asked to do this tonight is because I've been with LPA Architects now for about 25 years, and my prime responsibility is designing civic centers, which includes city halls, libraries, community centers, nature centers, and public spaces of all kinds. I'm also on the board for the South Bay LA Long Beach chapter of the AIA, and I'm a proud 20-year Long Beach resident, so it's a particular honor for me to be here tonight mediating this event. We'd like to start first with our opening remarks, and we're very honored to have Dr. Suja Lowenthal here to make those remarks. Dr. Lowenthal is an urban planner elected to represent the 2nd District in a special election held in 2006. She was re-elected in 2008 and 2012. She served as vice mayor from 2010 to 2012. She holds a bachelor degree in economics from UCLA, a master's in business administration from California State University, Los Angeles, and a doctorate in policy planning and development from USC. Suja's professional background includes over 14 years of experience in the water industry, serving as an adjunct professor at California State University, Long Beach, and currently serves in management capacity at the City of Santa Monica's transit agency, the Big Blue Bus. Suja had the distinct honor of being asked to speak at the Technology, Entertainment and Design Conference about her urban planning work globally to shape cities for the future, as well as her work here in Long Beach. In addition, she's had the opportunity to present at the United Nations and World Bank on best practices of local government, to implement litter management strategies and associated costs of plastic pollution. She has provided the political will and leadership to advance the city's award-winning bicycle-friendly agenda, downtown visioning, historic preservation, progressive strategies in animal care services, and green policies involving plastic bags, recycling, stormwater runoff, and alternative forms of energy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor to present Dr. Suja Lowenthal.
Thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and really see such a nice crowd. Welcome to the first in a series of engaging discussions about public and some private spaces in the city of Long Beach. I think you're all here because you love this city, and even if you don't live here and you have projects here, I think there's an affinity that you have for this city, and I don't think you'd be here interested in having a visionary discussion, the start of many, I hope, about our Civic Center and what it can be. I'd like to thank the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, Long Beach Heritage, and other sponsors for hosting this event this evening. I especially want to thank Laura. I don't know where she is, but there she is, hiding. I want to thank her. She is really tireless in how she pulled all of this together, and really responsible for all of you being here. I think we're a diverse crowd here with different interests, and that's how Civic Center planning should be, have a diverse group of individuals coming together to really envision what our public space could be. This is really a beneficial discussion about the soul of our city and really the importance of public spaces in the city's identity. So I want to thank all of you for attending this evening, to want to be a part of that. I see a lot of friendly faces in the audience tonight, partners in ongoing projects, and even those who have commiserated with me about our misguided city projects in the past. I think we've all shared in that, some of you from the professional capacity and others just as residents, but I do think we realize some of the weaknesses in the planning of the past, and hopefully that's why we're coming together to avoid that going forward. But tonight we've come to learn more about the history of our Civic Center and to discuss the future possibilities for this incredible space in our downtown core. And I think you see from the video earlier, the slideshow, really what our potential is. Our potential is to realize the best of who we can be incorporates the best of who we were in the past. And so I was really, really touched by that. I'm not from Long Beach. I'm sure many of you are. I've only lived here 15 years, but there's something to be said for when you choose to live in a city and when you fall in love with a city, as opposed to when you're born and you sort of inherit the history. Here, when you're coming and you've only been here for a few years, you really want to know more, and you really want to be a part of the fabric of this community. And I think we see that all throughout. But for those of you who are from here, I think we're really lucky. And for those of us who choose to be here, even luckier, because we can be. And so I think that makes it even more magical to come together to re-envision and envision our future. Before we get too far, I've been asked to dispel some rumors out there that involve the Civic Center that may distract from tonight's discussion. And I just want to share, there is no plan from the city, from where the city stands and what the city's perspective is. Currently, there is no plan or design that's already in place for a Civic Center. I think everything is open. It's an open canvas. There certainly have been discussions, but there's no plan or design in place. Any discussion involving City Hall, main library, the park, will occur in public. And I think you've seen that. I think you've seen in the last 6 years really a defensible process in just about everything I've taken on planning-wise, from the visioning process to any discussion that involves the downtown or planning in the second district. It's been through a public process, and I can assure you that's going to happen here as well. What we want is a forum where passionate and informed opinions can be exchanged really in public and in a full view discussion, and also including the city council. That being said, I have to admit that I may have had a hand in those rumors, since I've been one of those passionate, if not most passionate, voice calling for a civic center visioning process that brings the best architectural firms and proposals to Long Beach. I've been very vocal about it. I think many of you, I look around the room, I've talked to many of you about that somewhere in the very near future, I do see a better civic center, one that really is a great public space for the community, our public living room. So I have had many of those discussions, really airing my own desires and personal vision and hoping that we can collectively make that happen. Of course, that would take lots of resources, lots of creativity and ingenuity, but I have been very public about that. So if I have contributed to some notion that it's already done, I want to set that aside and share with you, really, I'm just dreaming out loud. And really, I think that's why we're here too, so we can dream out loud about the possibilities of what your public living space and my public living space can look like. I'm really a very big believer in the potential of our civic center and its role in defining our city's character. As far back as the downtown visioning process that I had initiated in 2007 with then Councilmember Bonnie Lowenthal, I encouraged the mayor, the city council, the city manager, and staff to think about the potential of our civic center. That was included in at least that initial envisioning process. Many of you served on that committee. I know that some of you are here this evening, and it was a great process, and the product was a wonderful product. Such discussions even influenced a study session and conversation around the Civic Center, seismic evaluation with cost scenarios ranging from $78 million to $150 million, depending on whether we only repaired structural weaknesses in the concrete wings of City Hall or pursued a newly constructed City Hall, library, and park. So the range was quite steep, $78 million to $150 million. This would have triggered a civic center visioning process similar to the one that produced the downtown vision and plan. And I've also been very vocal about calling for a civic center visioning process prior to the economy really taking the turn that it did. That is a discussion that we had, and we were preparing to bring that to council, and the timing was not right. In 2008, Mayor Foster and City Council discussed the possibility of including the Civic Center in Measure I think some of us remember that, but we decided to limit the ballot measure's focus to our streets, sidewalks, and alleys. The measure failed to get the necessary 2/3 vote, and again in 2008, as we struggled with an entrenched homeless population and tired, chopped up space with little to no programming at Lincoln Park, we explored the possibilities of bringing an amphitheater with 50 free music events every year to a reconstructed park in collaboration with the Levitt Pavilion Foundation. And I think many of you are familiar with the Levitt Pavilion. They were in discussions with me and our then Parks and Rec manager, Phil Hester, hoping that we could pull that off together here to activate a Lincoln Park in a way that we see in other cities such as MacArthur Park in LA, Pasadena, and other places. And unfortunately, the city's contribution to construction and programming was too large of a commitment for us at that time. The fundraising commitment year after year was too large of a commitment. And while the loss of a redevelopment agency and serious dip in commercial real estate has cast a shadow over construction in downtown for the last few years, I believe it may provide us with an opportunity to discuss an expanded view of our civic space. With great adversity, I do think we have great opportunities, and perhaps this is a time for us to look at other ways of funding such a vision. What are the prospects of creating a comprehensive downtown civic center made up of properties such as the new and old county courthouse and the old state office building? How can we incorporate the relocation of our harbor department into the expanded civic center? And again, I've been very public about my interest in having the new harbor department administrative buildings right here in the downtown. If not right with Civic Center, right where Civic Center is, somewhere very close. I think they can be a great partner and really a great asset in the downtown. And I know Vice Mayor Garcia and I, together with Councilmember DeLong, wrote a letter to that effect, signed that letter to the port about a year ago, asking them that while they consider where their new home is going to be, that they consider being a part of a civic center, a newly envisioned civic center. It can be dynamic, it can be truly a statement from this city that all services that really people wish to engage with and celebrate as being part of the heart of their city can be assembled somewhat within a campus or a quad with true public space in between. So we have been very public about that as well, and hopefully that will occur, and hopefully they will move to the downtown. I think they will. What would a civic center look like if we can run our blue line down the World Trade Center rather than cutting our downtown in half at First Street? That's also a discussion that I've had. I went to Metro, LA Metro last year, actually earlier this year, late last year, to discuss the possibility and what would it take to realign the end point as well as the starting point, such that it makes sense for our downtown, such that it captures where the population really is. Right now, if you look at the terminus of the blue line, it hasn't evolved to where the true downtown core is, and there's a potential, and I worry, and I think some of you also worry, that it may end up creating two downtowns, and that's disastrous. You have one where the transportation serves, and then one where the real development is, and then where does Civic Center fit into that? So I'm hoping that a Civic Center visioning process really reunites a fractured downtown. I do believe it's somewhat fractured right now, and the blue lines contributed to some of that. And so I think that has to be a very big part of this discussion of how do we re-envision this. What opportunities does a private market offer in the way of a P3 collaboration? We see that with the courthouse development and how amazing that's coming forward. I think that's opened up possibilities for us. You don't often find municipalities that want to be the first at doing something, even though P3 legislation the enabling legislation has been in place in the state of California for many years. We see very few projects. And so this courthouse, the fact that it is a P3 project happening right here in our city opens up those possibilities for us to consider it. And it's possible, and the enabling legislation's in place. And so I think we can take that and really run with that in terms of how does this get financed? What should we be discussing, or how should we be discussing how our civic center and surrounding properties can best serve the city and contribute to the vibrancy of downtown for generations to come? Like great parks, plazas, promenades, and other public spaces, civic centers serve as great equalizers. And I think that's where my personal connection comes. Growing up in India, we had large civic quads where it didn't matter where you came from and where you lived. That's really where the public art and public theater and public gathering and even political debate took place. And so those are great equalizers from my own personal experiences, and I think all of us have seen that throughout the world. Great civic centers should reflect the best their city has to offer, namely its citizens, providing a functional space where the people's business and social affairs can be conducted without care of economic status, ethnicity, or age. Tonight and in future conversations, I look forward to hearing more about the elements that currently contribute to our civic center and those you feel should be changed. I truly appreciate your interest, your passion, and your opinion, and I'm very excited about being a part of this. I think certainly the council that you have in place right now wants the best for our civic center, truly fully believes that that is the way citizens can re-engage with its city, with its municipality, and in a true civic center. I'd like to see us open up our quad as a public living room for all of us, and for those of us who come for various purposes, not even just to engage with City Hall or the port or the courthouse, but really just to be in their space, and that's what I'm looking forward to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lowenthal. Our next speaker is Maureen Neely, and Maureen is a local reference librarian and owner of Housteries. Through this consulting business, Maureen has researched over 80 properties, residential, commercial, and multifamily throughout Long Beach. She also writes freelance for various publications about neighborhood histories, local lore, and architecture. She is a past board member of Long Beach Heritage and vice president of the Belmont Heights Community Association, past recipient of the Preservationist of the Year Award, and serves on the advisory board for the Historical Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Maureen Neely.
Okay, thank you. Everybody can hear me? Yes. Excellent. Okay. So I just got to tell you a little bit. I went up to the Huntington Library this weekend for a conference, and a history conference. What do you think? It's going to be kind of staid and, a lot of yawning going on and people trying to duck out after lunch. I cannot tell you the demographics of that room. I think there was at least 120, 130 people, all ages, young, old, all ethnicities, everything. And I turned to my friend that I went with and I said, wow, history is hot. And it was great to see that kind of engagement about Los Angeles history and Southern California history. So obviously history's hot because look at you guys. You are all here and we are going to talk a little bit about the history of the Civic Center because of course as a historian it's hard for me to, I always have to say, you can't really move forward effectively if you don't understand where you've been. So that's the point of my little presentation here today. So we can't really understand where we've been with the Civic Center until we look at Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park used to be called City Park, of course, when it was first deeded to the city in about 1888 was, when the city was incorporated more or less, and the Long Beach Land and Water Company gave us this area for a city park. And at that time they did call it City Park. A few years later they called it Pacific Park, and then when the Lincoln statue was brought to the park in 1915 they called it Lincoln Park. So this is a picture in 1895 of the first cornerstone laid for the first City Hall. That was in 1895. And then just a short while later, a parcel tax, a library parcel tax was enacted to create a true free public library in the city of Long Beach, because we take free public libraries for granted, but up until the mid-1800s and even a little later, the word free wasn't necessarily in that. You had to subscribe to a library. So this was in the tradition of a free public library, but for that we taxed ourselves a parcel tax. So it's funny, but as soon as 1907, there were calls to sell City Park from the business community for about $1 million. We could get $1 million for this park and use this money to seed municipal utilities. And we could replace that lost parkland with an enhanced park over where Bixby Park is now. It used to be called Alamitos Park. So interesting, kind of the idea of a land swap, sell this civic center or this city park in the middle of town and expand the one on the east side where a lot of growth was taking place. So some other citizens, so some of the people that thought that was a good idea was Jotham Bixby, you know his name, and C.J. Walker with Farmers and Merchants Bank. But equally prominent citizens said, no, expressing concern that the park not be sold, and I love this quote, just because a little group of capitalists will be benefited thereby. And that is kind of a futuristic man. This was W.W. Lowe. The day is coming when, as a public park, it will be one of the most valuable assets of the city. Centrally located parks, when they exist, should never be disposed of. And despite his poor grammar, which of course bothers me, he really had something to say about that. So that was 1907. They decided, yes, we're going to go ahead and keep, Pacific Park, then Lincoln Park. And the library board began advocating for a new Carnegie Library. So we had the City Hall. The library was housed in City Hall, in a room in City Hall. And obviously, we were growing and we needed to have a real library. So the city held the deed that was revised then in 1905 from the Long Beach Land and Water Company that expressly gave permission to erect a library building in the park. Remember, this was dedicated parkland. You weren't supposed to have any structures in it. Several citizens objected to the building of any structure in the park, but their objections were overruled and the Carnegie Library opened in 1909. So there's the opening day in 1909. That was our Carnegie Library. It's pretty, huh? Okay. So I should go back to that. 1913, we put a bond measure on the ballot to fund a new city hall, and it failed. And then in 1919, a second bond measure succeeded, and so the plans for a new city hall designed by local master architects Horace Austin and Harvey Lockridge was put into place. And then in 1921, just 2 years later, of course, oil hits on Signal Hill. All of a sudden, we're a boom town. So I'm trying to interject also what was going on in the city at the time so that you kind of get an idea of why we're growing the way we are. So on the left of this picture is the old city hall that was erected in 1895, and you can see the new hit city hall on the right that was erected in 1923. I like this, they're side by side. They weren't actually side by side, we did move the old city hall at one point. And there's a better picture of that new city hall in 1923. And it was interesting, in 1923, a movement to create a true civic center by acquiring adjacent land to Lincoln Park was started. And these included plans for a new library, a courthouse, an auditorium, along with City Hall. One official who declined to be quoted, thank you, Suja, for allowing yourself to be quoted, because this official declined to be quoted. This official said, every other city of any size and ambition is building a civic center. It's 1923. Long Beach has made a splendid beginning, and with the park and City Hall as this nucleus, we can soon have a setting for its public buildings, which will be unrivaled in the West. Fantastic. 1933, we had an earthquake. It's just a minor thing. It caused the library to move outside into tents in the park and into temporary housing downtown. What do you think, Darla? However, 1933, so what was going on in the 30s? We had a little bump in the economy. So we put a bond measure on the ballot to rebuild the library, and it failed. So fortunately, though, we had some federal funds that we could use, and the WPA, Works Progress Administration, came to the rescue. The remodeled building for the library doubled in size and was rededicated in 1937. And that's what it looked like. You can see, if I go back, you kind of see the that other library. Yeah, so you can see kind of the outline of it, and then when you go through and look at the new one, it wasn't totally new, it was a redo, keeping the same, but they did add quite a bit of space. What was really nice, though, about this library, of course, is they also provided some art, and there's the murals by Suzanne Miller depicting scenes from children's literature. When we did build the new library that's there now, it's in the serial section of the library, so they took down many of the panels and reinstalled them in the current library. The damage to City Hall, so that was the library, but the damage to City Hall, believe it or not, was not as extensive, but enough that a 15-year plan was sketched out for city buildings. This was the 1933 plan. It's kind of faded, I'm sorry about that, it's from the newspaper, but it has the old library and the new library, and then a couple of present buildings, and you can see that new City Hall in the background, up on the very top left-hand corner. And then the bottom picture is of the new library. So, you know, like we said, already in 33, we're thinking grander, 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 lots of vision. But eventually, you know, the idea of actually putting this plan into place just was too intimidating. And so City Hall just got a major facade renovation or major renovation in the popular now, the kind of that Art Deco modern style of the mid-30s. And that's what this was now our City Hall for years and years. How many people here remember that City Hall? Just about every, well, I would think a few more people would, no? Wow, it wasn't that long ago. All right, so now we hit World War II. Let's see. And the rebuilt Carnegie Library, the renovated City Hall, they were still too small for the growing population. What happened here after World War II? We got another population boom. So we thought that in our post-war world, the Civic Center should include, and this is, again, a lot of people, not really citizens saying this. This is what's so unusual. Suja, Dr. Lowenthal was talking about, you know, having a lot of civic input and residential input. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, that was not necessarily the case. So, keep that in mind as we talk about how our current Civic Center got built. So, in the post-war world, we thought the Civic Center Committee of the Chamber of Commerce were the ones kind of driving a new Civic Center. And in 1945, the ideas included to kind of make a Civic Center mall. It looks kind of like the one in Washington, D.C. that was spread out along Long Beach Boulevard from Ocean to 7th Street, if you can imagine that. Perhaps we should have a Civic Center at the foot of Long Beach Boulevard and put it south of Ocean Boulevard and landscape the roofs as it goes down the hill. Or maybe we should have one at the Alamedos and 1st Street in the shadow of the Villa Riviera and Pacific Coast Club. Notice what's happening here. City Hall, Civic Center is kind of moving east. It's not in what we consider the downtown. So these are some of the ideas that are out there. Well, the city planning director at the time, Werner Ruckti, reached out to agencies and cultural organizations for input in developing a plan for a city of what he imagined would be 500,000 people. All right? Which we almost are, right? That was in the 40s. But notice I said he reached out to agencies and cultural organizations. Again, not necessarily to individuals and public citizens. So after several years of noodling all of this, 3 sites were under serious consideration. One was going from the beach, Ocean Boulevard, to 4th Street, Magnolia to Pacific. All right, I hope it's kind of grainy again, but you can kind of see the streets there. You notice that, so number 1 on here is the City Hall. And you can see it's going actually south of Ocean. And then included in this are things like a museum and an opera house, as well as a city hall and a library, state building, county courthouse. All right, there was another plan. How about this one? This is exciting. Anybody know where this is? Rainbow Pier. Well, already it was kind of going downhill, Rainbow Pier, and so why not fill it in, make this beautiful drive, and put in the Veterans Memorial Building, a city and county building, a library, a museum, a city hall, an exhibit hall, and then also keep the auditorium there. That's called the Lagoon Project. And I'll tell you, a lot of people really like this project. The third site was interesting in that it went from 7th Street to 12th Street, between Pacific and Chestnut. And again, it kind of has that mall look, like a Washington, D.C. mall look, very traditional in that effect. Tempers flared over these sites. I mean, I'm reading in the paper about, how the discussions went with the Planning Commission and the City Council and the various entities. Oh, people were in an uproar. And why were they in an uproar? This is what's so interesting. The chamber backed the Lagoon site. So here we go. And this is what they said. First of all, they wanted to call for a national competition for our Civic Center. We are a great city. We should have the best. Site number 1, which was that first site back here, the chamber said, was a hodgepodge of buildings set in between standing apartments, hotels, and churches. Well, you can kind of see that. What you can't see on this map, but there's still the Sovereign and the Blackstone are still down on Ocean. The Wilmore is still there. The church, First Congregational Church, is all part of this, and the Omar Hubbard building, which of course is no longer there. So, there's all these kind of private entities that are pretty major in size that we had to build our Civic Center around. So the chamber thought this was a very bad idea. And also the chamber said that the Lagoon site would save taxpayer money because nothing would have to be cleared. We wouldn't have to buy any of that property to use the lagoon. So no property taxes would be lost on what was essentially fallow land, obviously. All right. Well, city staff favored site number 1. The one at Broadway and Pacific, this one right here. And they said because perhaps the lagoon site violated the state tidelands grant. So you're building things on what's really not yours. And the city planning director thought that the cost to improve the lagoon would be too high. However, this figure was challenged by a structural engineer. And then others said that the city said that the shoreline should be kept free of development, that there should be uses for recreation there, and also that it would be better if the Civic Center was closer to businesses. So I bring all this up. I know it's kind of kind of picky stuff, but I was struck by the conversation being so contemporary, because we are struggling with these same things today. So in 1948, so nothing was really solved, but in 1948, it was really looking like the Civic Center was going to be pretty much where it is today in some shape or form. And this was a kind of a futuristic photo or drawing, rendition, if you will, of modernistic buildings in 1948. So you can see it's, again, that kind of mall effect, and you're starting to see these 1940s, 50s architecture coming to fruit. Now this is kind of the mindset of modern. But still, by 1948, nothing was necessarily decided, because, not the least of because the two elephants in the room, and I know some of the people here probably know what they were. We were in litigation with the state over Tideland's oil money. We didn't even know what kind of money we'd have, what we'd be getting out of our oil offshore, and we were fighting with the state about that. And then related to that is, what are we going to do with the downtown that's sinking? We were still in the middle of trying to solve the problem of subsidence. So again, tempers were short. Anybody who thought that the 1950s was kind of this time of, hey, yeah, Ozzie and Harriet, that's not so much. One council meeting lasted almost to midnight, and there were several council people that were very concerned that by kind of not making a decision on where our Civic Center was going to go was creating terrible blight in our downtown. Because the people who did have owned hotel buildings or owned property there, they were on hold for decades. So, this is kind of a property rights issue. Another concern was that the county courthouse actually could be built because there was funding for that. So let's go ahead with that. That was one of the comments. Let's just go ahead with that, and then we'll see where we go when we get the funding for the rest. And several councilmen took issue with that because that seemed like it was poor planning. And I love this. If we did that, we would never have any public improvements. So, they were very realistic about that. And that the places that were downtown that were kind of awaiting any kind of decision, these private businesses and apartments and housing, were already under a cloud. And so we should probably just let them go. So two councilmen kept insisting that the people be allowed to vote, and that we put this Civic Center idea and where it is and what we're going to do on the ballot. But they were overruled. So 6-2 in the mid-1950s, the city council opted for the current smaller site that we have right now that is bordered by Ocean and Broadway, Magnolia, and Pacific. Now, also, though, what was happening in the 50s, especially the mid-50s, and you really can't say, oh, bad city council, oh, bad businessmen who, did all this chamber, et cetera. The general population was pretty tired of downtown. They weren't coming down here. They've moved up to Lakewood. They've moved out to the east side. They've moved up to North Long Beach and Bixby. So, they weren't part of the process, and they weren't making their wishes known. They were voting to tax themselves. They taxed themselves for branch libraries, for marina improvement, park development, the public safety building, and hospital expansion. But the Civic Center, the main library, all of those were pretty abandoned by the taxpayers and by the voting public. And also, just keep in mind, I'm going to bring it up, the Press Telegram, the paper, shaped public and political opinion very, very much. They had a huge influence on how our city ran things. We brought the Queen Mary here in 1967. We did get a lot of Tideland's oil funds, so those enriched our city coffers. Subsidence was resolved, and we started working with something called a redevelopment agency. So all of a sudden things started turning around in the 1960s. And that's important, and two things got built in downtown in these early years in the 1960s. The public safety building was designed in a pretty cool modern style, as well as the current courthouse that we have today. Both of those buildings made a statement. We may not think it was big now, but then it was, hey, we do believe in downtown. Hey, we do want to continue to have a downtown. So those buildings were very important for that reason. So as we all know, the current Civic Center was built, as were several parking garages. But what we now realized is that this was done without benefit of a public buy-in through the ballot box. So frustrated civic leaders sought other avenues for funding. Well, what was that? In this particular case, sorry, I'm boring you with this one slide. In this particular case, in 1968-69, our former mayor, what was his name again? Oh yeah, Burton Chase. Burton Chase. He had been elected to the County Board of Supervisors, but he was, our former mayor and a council member back in the 40s. Well, he put together a plan, because now he was a supervisor for the county, using what he called the Long Beach, Los Angeles County Civic Center Authority to finance the building of a new library and city hall, thus circumventing a vote by the populace. Creativity and a strong constitution was what was needed to get this Civic Center built where it was. So once the funding was found and promises were made, the Civic Center we see today became a reality. And that is, you can see this is the old Civic Center, just waiting to watch. Okay, let's see. The Veterans Building is on your left. This is on Broadway. So Broadway between Cedar and Pacific. So the Veterans Memorial Building is on your left. In the center is the utilities, municipal utilities building. And then the tallest building there you recognize as our 1923, 1933 revised City Hall. What you can't see in this photo is that Pacific Avenue actually runs into the middle of that City Hall. And the street goes around it. Kind of like a little island there. So these buildings we're watching as the Lincoln Park got re-landscaped, and the Lonely Library was the last little building standing there in 1973 as things started to get torn down around it. The library had a fire in 1970 which pretty much sealed its fate, and this is what kind of the last little holdout in Lincoln Park. So the current main library and City Hall, part of the Burton Chase Civic Center, were dedicated in May 1977. And Chase was honored in this manner, first for his role in the 1940s. He presided over those turbulent times where we were trying to find a site and all that. And second, for his creative financing that he came up with. And finally, he was named named the Burton Chase Civic Center in honor of his untimely death in 1972 in a car accident. So, oh, I thought I had another photo here. So finally, do we have any Zen practitioners here? Anybody practice Zen? Okay, that's good, because you should not be here. Because then, what I found out this weekend is that apparently, if you practice Zen, there is no past and there is no future. Ha! I say ha! So we're going to look now, the next speaker is going to look at our Civic Center's current design. And as I was putting this presentation together, I thought, the current design, with its, we know what it looks like. It's got that soaring tower of concrete, but yet it's surrounded by a green park. Think about it. It's like a conflict, right? It's got conflict there. And I'm wondering if these struggles, that we had building the Civic Center and where we are today is not unique to any era, obviously, any city or any people. We just saw, 5 minutes or 10 minutes of this has been going on for decades. So I think we can appreciate the difficulty of this project, and we can only marvel, knowing how long that the road was traveled, that we came up actually with something so unique and futuristic at such a time. So I have to say, well done, Long Beach, and I'm so glad we're here. All right.
very much, Maureen. It's really intriguing that we keep seemingly repeating the past. So I'm hoping that tonight we'll actually sort of move forward and do things a little differently. Our next speaker is Alan Pullman. And as founder of Studio 111, Alan Pullman, AIA, leads design teams on mixed-use urban infill and adaptive reuse projects. With over 20 years of experience in architecture and urban design, he has led project teams on a number of award-winning developments and is committed to enhancing communities through incremental urbanism, the development of modest projects that emphasize placemaking. Pullman is a registered architect in California and an active member of the American Institute of Architects and the Urban Land Institute, where he serves on the Inner City Council. He is also a board member for the Long Beach Conservation Corps and a partner in East Village Partners, a community-based infill developer. Pullman received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Syracuse University. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Pullman, AIA.
Thanks, Rick. Maureen said I was going to talk a little bit about the design of the project, but that's intimidating because one of the architects of the project is actually sitting right here. So I'm going to put him on the spot to talk about it. Yeah. I'm really going to talk a little bit more about the context. What I wanted to provide was a little, can you hear me? A little bit of an architectural context. What was going on at the time the new Civic Center was designed. And as architects, we don't design in a vacuum. We might say it just springs forth from our minds and our creativity. But actually, how many architects are in the room? I don't want to spill the secrets, but we all actually, we're shaped and we think about what the context is, what's going on in the architectural world, what other architects are doing certainly influences us. And it also influences our clients as well. And they look to see what, the city manager or mayor says, oh, Dallas City Hall, I want one of those. So it really, we all work in a context, and I want to just talk a little bit, a brief overview about what that context was at the time, and then Don can speak and debunk everything I say, because he was there. But this building, people are trying to say, what is the style of this Civic Center? And really, it's a modern building. That's the most succinct way I could put it. It's a late modern building, but it is a modern building. And there were a lot of, modernism was influenced by a lot of important architects. But one of probably the most influential in particular was the Swiss architect Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier was working in Europe before the wars and after the wars. And he was really interested in the poetic aspects of architecture, making these beautiful forms and out of materials that were available and sort of economical and honest. And he was one of the architects that worked really specifically with concrete, as opposed to the kind of architects making these glass and steel buildings that really became the architecture, the modern architecture of the corporate world. Le Corbusier really created the architecture sort of the civic world using concrete. And they became a language that was really influential to architects and still amazingly influential to architects even today. One of the architects that was obviously very influenced by Le Corbusier was Paul Rudolph. And this is a building, the Yale School of Art and Architecture, that was incredibly influential to American architects in the 60s. You can see there's Paul Rudolph there standing in front of this bush-hammered concrete wall. And I think when this was published, when it was built, it was heavily praised and highly published. And it really, you could see the strong architectural forms, the abstraction. It was something that really influenced a lot of architects and a lot of people that were looking for civic buildings. It became the architectural style of campuses. It's probably one of the buildings that really, they came to this term that people used to describe the style, and the term was brutalist, and it really came from the French term for raw concrete. It's a little bit of an unfortunate term. It's not exactly warm and fuzzy when we say a building is brutalist. But the building was incredibly influential and praised, and then it fell out of favor, and people, students hated it, and everyone sort of mocked it. But now it's back, and that's kind of an interesting thing about architecture, style, and fashion. Things kind of come and go. And I was recently there, and it was beautifully restored, and it's actually a fantastic building. And I think the school is very proud to have it as part of their campus. Another incredibly influential architect to many, really icon of American modernism, was Louis Kahn. This is a building that he was an East Coast architect. He worked all over the world, but this is a building he did in La Jolla. It's an amazing building. You know, it uses the stark, abstract forms of modernism, but it's more refined. The concrete isn't this rough and ready concrete. It's machine formed or a steel trowel formed. And the detailing is elegant, the symmetry is very formal. It's a really beautiful building. And I think it was, again, his work was incredibly, was it influential to you, Don?
Very much. I love that guy's work. This is one of the best buildings in California.
It really is. It's a stunning building, and it really influenced so many architects in how to create these beautiful poetic spaces.
Concrete is so expensive now.
Yeah, but was it all?
Can't do it anymore.
No. Especially that kind of work. Now another architect, this guy is a little bit more well known. I.M. Pei, still, you know, his firm is still around, and he was another very prolific architect. You know, he worked at the Louvre, but he also did the National Gallery. This is his Dallas City Hall. So you can see again that sort of legacy of modernism. Bold forms, it's an inverted pyramid in this case. Concrete exposed to create those forms. A big public plaza in the front. Not a lot of landscaping, I would say. It really became the sort of de rigueur, late modern sort of grammar of civic buildings. There were so many of these were built post-war. It really became what cities were looking for, these simple elementary forms. They were fairly cost-effective, but they contained a certain amount of monumentality, a certain kind of permanence and boldness. And if you think about the 60s and what a turbulent time it was for the country, you could see why maybe a civic municipality or city would want something that spoke, well, one, that was cost-effective, but also was very permanent, very bold, very almost monumental in its forms. And that's really what this architecture, in a lot of ways, was about. Now, that's just a little bit of context. I'll quickly go over another architect who's not as well known, Kevin Roach and John Dinklow Associates. And Kevin Roach is still actually a practicing architect. But at the time, very influential, very widely published architect. And I think that there are a couple of buildings that he did that are really very relevant to our Civic Center that are interesting to look at. You know, Kevin Roach was this another highly praised architect who in the 80s probably became the symbol of everything that's wrong with modern architecture. And yet now, I just read a review in the New York Times, he's being reevaluated and architects are looking again. So it's interesting how things kind of come and they go and they change, and our perspective really is fluid and it changes. Okay, so the Long Beach Civic Center, now besides the public, you know, so when we talked about the public service building, public safety building, and the municipal court, right? So those are two elements that were there that this new project incorporated into a campus-like environment. There are two other major buildings, besides Lincoln Park, that are part of our Civic Center, two main structures. One is this vertical tower that houses, you know, council chambers and staff and electeds, and then the low-lying main library. And they're two distinct elements, really different in conception, but also quite complementary. And I think what's interesting is they took two ideas that were out there in the architectural thinking and put them together in a unique and interesting way. So the first building I'm going to talk about, oops, I think I skipped a slide here. No, I guess I didn't. Is what's called the Knights of Columbus building. So that's the building on the left. And that was done by Kevin Roach, and that was in 1968 or 69. And it was a revolutionary building in a lot of ways. And then to the right is our Civic Center. So can anyone see any similarities there between those two? What was revolutionary about this building? You think about a tower, right? And in a tower, the core, you know, so you have stairs and elevators and all the things that support the building, and they're typically in the middle of the building. What Kevin Roach did is he pulled them out to the outside. This is a concept of Louis Kahn about served spaces and then the servant spaces that support the served spaces. And he liked to articulate those pieces. That's exactly what Roach did in this building. He pulled the stairs and the elevators and the course out of the middle of the building to open up the middle of the building, which was really unique, and it created this great open space in the middle. And then he expressed those as two elements here with then these concrete cores spanned by steel in between. So again, here's a sort of a comparison. I think that the Roach building is a little taller, so I wish ours was a little taller too, frankly. But Roach's building is kind of dark. It's covered with like a terracotta tile, and it's brick-like. It's a little like a kind of abstracted fortress, I suppose. Our building is very similar, and it pulls on the same kind of revolutionary ideas of a tower, but I think Don did a better job. It's more elegant. The concrete is more interesting than the brick, and I think there's some wonderful, you know, sort of sculptural qualities to that building that Roach's doesn't have. But still, they both talk about monumental scale. They both were inspired, or at least Roach's was inspired by infrastructure, but also, you know, like things like freeways. We were coming out of the time of freeway building and these big can-do kind of projects. It was forward-looking. It was also a really strong marker, you know. And so if you, again, were a city that wants to say, here we are, here's the future, and we want to make a place in an environment, this was a bold kind of tower way of doing that. What mayor or city manager wouldn't want to make that kind of a statement? So we have this sort of the idea of what a tower in the 60s and 70s, you know, could be, and what some of the ideas about the tower were. And then we have this totally different idea. So we're going to go back to Kevin Roach. And while the tower is this imposing, you know, sort of monument and marker in the landscape, then Kevin Roach at the same time did this building, which is the Oakland Museum. And it's almost like the opposite. Instead of just saying, here we are, and imposing on the landscape, this is actually integrating into landscape. And so the Oakland Museum, which was Roach's actually first project in '68, was when it was built, Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the critic at the New York Times, said, in terms of design and environment, it might be the most thoroughly revolutionary structure in the world. And it had a landscape design by Dan Kiley, who was a leading practitioner of landscape design. And really what it was is an architecture of flowing into the environment, a seamless transition into landscape, very organic, where the building and the environment were one. And it was in Oakland. It was the People's Museum. So the idea that people would always be able to use it and use it as a park and make it an open, flowing integration into landscape. So what was really so clever about our library building, where you had this imposing administrative city council building, you had this people's building, which was the library. And because you had to keep open park space on the site, you could actually have the library and have the park space all together. And taking that example of what Kevin Roach and Dan Kiley, the landscape architect, did here, was kind of a very clever integration of two really bold ideas about making civic architecture. We didn't have Dan Kiley to do the landscape, but we had equally as renowned Peter Walker. And Peter Walker is still practicing as a landscape architect. His most recent project was the 9/11 Memorial in New York. So the goal here was the People's Library as opposed to the City Tower. I'm just going to go back to Oakland for a second. This is a roof deck shot. It's a little different than ours, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's soft and it's very inviting. And but when it was first built, it wasn't that way. It was very geometric, and you could see the influence of sort of abstract art in this particular landscape piece. But that's what we have now. And I'd show that because there's so many similarities between these two buildings. I think it's interesting to see what is the potential that can be done rethinking what our library is. I'll go back. Now, what's interesting about the Oakland Museum, it was built, it wasn't terribly successful, but it recently has undergone an amazing renovation. And if you can go there, please do. It's really a wonderful, wonderful space. And it wasn't a lot of things that were done. It was like, I would call it tweaking and re-landscaping, but it's really become an amazingly wonderful place to be. And I'll just end with 2 slides here of what, this is on the roof deck looking back out to the garden spaces that were there. And this is back at the garden space looking back towards the building. And I think so much of this has to do with how the landscape was treated, how programming happens, that really makes it a wonderful place in the city. And I think it's worth thinking, what do we have that maybe we could improve upon and think about how we could rethink some of the architecture that we currently have as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. The next presenter, I'm actually a big fan of. I have a huge amount of respect for his work. Don Gibbs, FAIA, is a Long Beach native attending Poly High and USC before serving in the US Navy. He joined his father's architectural practice, Hugh Gibbs, FAIA, in 1960, and has designed many notable buildings at Cal State Long Beach, including the Carpenter Center, the Dance Studio, and the renowned Pyramid. Other notable buildings include the Terrace Theater in Long Beach, his office on Long Beach Boulevard, which is, I think, probably one of the best modern buildings in Long Beach, the Veterans Administration and Hospital buildings, and the Civic Center in Norwalk. In 1973, the City of Long Beach commissioned a team of architects to design a new Civic Center, led by Gibbs & Gibbs, called Allied Architects. Allied Architects was also comprised, of Wing & Wing, Killingsworth, Brady & Associates, and Homolka & Associates. Today, Don Gibbs lives with his wife in a home he designed in Palos Verdes and spends his time on architecture, boat building, and art. Ladies and gentlemen, Don Gibbs, AIA.
Alan said it all. I don't have much to say. I don't know, can we get back to the slide that shows the overall down, aerial view? That's the wrong building, yeah. Not that one. Not that one. Oh, the one that Alan started with, or that was on the screen. Anyway, oh, that one, there, okay, so one of our objectives was to create this plaza or city living room and so on and around the city hall. And all the rest of these lower buildings were intentionally to contrast with the city hall, the verticality of the city hall. Because in doing commercial buildings, you don't have a real opportunity to do the same things you do for your city hall. And by the way, if you ever get a chance to do your city hall, go for it. It's a lot of fun. But anyway, there's an amphitheater, what was an amphitheater in there that was, I guess she's left already. And the amphitheater was designed with seats originally, and we wanted to have concerts there and speeches and people meeting there. But the city council at the time says we can't have the seats because we don't want anybody gathering there. We don't want people around voicing their opinions. And so this idea of the city's living room and all that was one of our goals, but it wasn't politically attainable at the moment. But the structure is still there to do it, and we've got the edges around that comprise the space that's defined by the colonnade and the lower buildings. Is designed. There's parts of it that are just fill, and so we can expand into that if there are other uses. If we bring in commercial things or restaurants or things that bring people in, there's the space to do it. And when we were designing the library, the librarian then, Mrs. Henselman, was very ambitious, and so she had programmed a 175,000 square foot library, which never did draw enough people in the location that it's at. So one of the possibilities is we have an additional 175,000 square feet that can work in conjunction with the Civic Center, that if you move the library somewhere else and make it more suitable for the demographics of the area. But anyway, it was a lot of fun to do it, and I don't think it's going to fall down. It's going to be okay, not to worry about it. I don't know. We just had a good time doing it, and Alan nailed every one of our enthusiasms, and it was just as he said. We got Peter Walker to do the landscaping on top for Lincoln Center, Lincoln Park, and he is doing, ground zero right now. So we've got a nice thing there that he did, even though it needs to be refurbished. I don't know what else to say except we need to bring vitality to it. It needs a couple things. It needs a better parking situation, and it needs I don't know, something like escalators to get up to the park, because people are not going to keep walking and doing that. And needs some vital things happening around that are not there right now. It was discouraged to do that, but now I think that sounds to me like people are ready to do it the next phase.
Didn't you have a restaurant as part of the design originally?
I designed one afterwards but it was never built.
And
And then we were talking with people from the library, and we did little schemes, and
wasn't there a museum too? I mean, IMP was designing a museum?
yeah, and IMP had designed a museum that was a part of it that's been replaced by that parking garage, beautiful thing that it is. And I had a good time going back there and visiting with IM, and, you know, we had a good time in New York, and nice few meals together, and he's a fantastic, charming guy, just like Alan, he's amazing. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, and I really admire his work. Anyhow, he was all in sympathy with the thing, and he was designing a building that would go along with our city hall. But it cost twice as much as the budget they had at the time, and so people weren't that enthusiastic about doing art museums. We missed that one. Anyway, it's great to grow up here. It's you know, my mother and father met at Poly High, if you can believe that one, gosh. And so at the time, we were, Long Beach had this idea, instead of going international for selecting architects, they would use the ones that were in town and supporting the community, and were part of the community. And that was a great advantage for us, because we had never done a city hall, and we had this chance to do it. We'd never done a big theater, and we had a chance to do the Pacific Terrace Theater, and the start of the convention center, and all those things. And so we were able to do other city halls and other kinds of things, thanks to the start we got with these nice projects in Long Beach. Anyway, thanks a lot. That's good.
Next, we are very lucky to, gosh, I keep doing that, I'm just gonna hold it. Next, we're very lucky to have Ken Odell. Ken Odell earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Architectural Engineering from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and joined MHP Incorporated, a Long Beach-based structural engineering firm, in 1989. He spends his professional time as a partner with MHP, specializing in structural design, seismic risk, forensic engineering, and business continuity risk management. As a licensed structural engineer in just over 10 states, he has enjoyed numerous Long Beach projects and provides staff guidance for design, coordination, project management, and construction support of projects. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Odell.
So this is really great, because I've been following Don Gibbs' projects around Long Beach for the last, probably 15 years now. I have the honor of actually working with the structural engineer, Frank Boll, who worked on the project with Don when the Civic Center was built. And it's just been a great kind of history lesson for me as well. I'm a transplant into the Long Beach area. I moved into Long Beach about 14 or so years ago after moving down to Southern California after school. But Frank has just great resource, and like I said, we've been kind of following Frank and Don's work through doing a number of projects for Long Beach Unified, and some of the local communities here, as well as Long Beach State. So it's a great honor. Why do you have a structural engineer talking to you about Civic Center design? Quite frankly, I raised my hand when they said that I wouldn't have to pay the $5 admission in order to sit here and learn all of this stuff. So this is great. Appreciate the opportunity. The Civic Center, I think one of the questions that I was kind of asked to talk to or to speak to is taking a building that has perceived issues. There's seismic reports out. There are considerations that have to be addressed with any building of age. And how do you take those considerations and move forward with the next step? And what should the next step, or what can the next step look like when you're dealing with a building that was built 73 to 2013? What is that? 40 years? 40 years. So what do you do with a 40-year-old building? And I think there is a perception in the global community that Southern California doesn't like old architecture, and Southern California likes to tear things down and replace them. One of the big responses to that was, well, of course, we live in some of the most seismically active regions of the world, and so we are very sensitive to old buildings and so forth. And so you get seismic reports. This building has been through a number of different reviews by a number of very prestigious firms. And it's a building that doesn't meet today's code. But what does that really mean? A lot of people will respond that, well, if a building doesn't meet today's code, it must be bad. There must be something wrong with it. I always caution people when they look at a building that doesn't meet today's code to kind of put it into context. If we were to tear down every 40-year-old building that doesn't meet today's code, we would be tearing down probably 80 to 90% of Southern California. We have to keep that in context. I'm actually going to challenge a little bit with I have 3 slides. I'm a structural engineer. I understand most people don't like to listen to structural engineers. So I have 3 slides. Set the stage for, this is the picture of the library going in. When you look at the architecture, there's a lot of concrete involved. But in fact, this building is a steel frame building with concrete architectural elements. Those elements serve some of the structure, but for the library, they serve it very well. So you have the shear walls, the concrete elements, supporting the steel frame. If I hit the right button, I will get to the tower. Again, a steel structure. And I'm going to challenge the architect. I've challenged Frank Boll that I don't think they went far enough with the structure for this, because the core elements, as Alan described, where you take your stairs and elevators and you put them in the core of your building in the center. This project moved those cores to the outside elements. But then this project wrapped those cores in a concrete skin, rather than taking advantage of the concrete to actually use it as part of the structure. Therein lies some of the perceived concerns, if you will, in that the concrete elements are very stiff and the steel frame is very flexible. So how do the two compete and how do the two work together? If those had actually been concrete shear walls, like the library, but just take them full height of the tower and integrate it into the structure of the system, perhaps a different conversation today.
Have you talked to Frank about this?
I have talked to Frank about this. That's why I'm here today and he isn't. He said, go ahead. But so the steel structure of this is what's called a moment frame. It bends and flexes with the earthquake. A concrete shear wall is a much stiffer element, so it bends and flexes a little bit less until you get to a very tall one, and then it acts as a tube. So the combined structural system of this is really the series of steel columns acting as a tube. And it's actually a very creative system as it comes down through the different floor levels. At the very bottom, does this have a pointer? Yes, at the very bottom, very shaky pointer because I'm up at the podium. At the very bottom, there are heavy transfer girders that allow the open footprint so that the public spaces, if you will, can flow into the more private spaces of the actual city hall. So it's a very nice, elegant design, and the structure kind of comes down and wraps around and then lands on the legs, allowing that tube to work as a structural system. Very creative, very neat way to do it. But like I said, there are ways that I would have challenged the team a little bit harder had I been doing it, but it was actually built when I think I was in grade school, so what can I really say about the challenges they were faced with? But I just love it. I again love the Long Beach area. This is one of those buildings that, in looking at the context of the built environment around Southern California, can you make a case to save it? Absolutely. Can you make a case that a new re-envisioned Civic Center could do something differently? Absolutely.
Bite your tongue.
I will bite my tongue and bleed on it. The point I want to make is make sure that when you're making your case, one way or the other, you recognize that the value of what is here doesn't stop with what you see. The value of what you have here is the historic context as it grows from where it was to where it can go. And that structurally speaking, there is no reason why you can't move forward with something that comes from the past. Thank you.
my bag in the room. Well, you know, it's right before my part. If you've got questions on the note cards, if you could pass them to the aisle, we're going to have someone collect them, and then we'll read them after, if we do get this up and going. I did forget to plug this in. Did you see in my bag there, there's the power source? Sorry.
I have a question while we're waiting.
Go for it.
Don, you had mentioned something about the interior, the chambers, the council chambers, and the intention you had as the architects of where the city council sat versus where the people sat.
Oh, it's just a little thing. I thought that a lot of city council chambers we looked at had the council up on a high podium. I thought it should just be the other way around, with the people being above the council. I thought that was a more appropriate way of looking at it. And another thing that I thought would be a good idea was to have the city council offices look down on the city manager's floor so they could see if they're really working down there. And they countered by putting up all kinds of temporary walls so they couldn't be seen. Anyway, a couple of little bits of humor.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Maureen. I owe you one. What I'd like to talk a little bit more about is the philosophy behind civic centers and why we're all here tonight. Exactly what is so important about civic centers and the whole idea of public open space, public places. I had the good fortune a while back of working with Cynthia Nikitin, who is the Vice President of Project for Public Spaces out of New York. And she's really an amazing person who has had a hand in designing and envisioning over 150 public open space civic center projects internationally. And her sort of mantra is here, which says, civic institutions such as libraries, parks, city halls, and cultural facilities are the foundations of civil society and the cornerstones of democracy. I firmly believe that, and this is sort of all that needs to be said, but as luck would have it, I have a lot more to say. So, what are the actual functional reasons why a civic center or city hall is important? The whole idea of centralized city services. You hear a lot lately about this sort of fragmentation of civic services and the sort of deconstruction of the civic center and really the non-existence of civic centers. Well, in the 20 years that I've been doing this, I have never actually come across that. I see exactly the opposite. What I'm seeing a lot of is this whole concept of the one-stop shop for city services, where every citizen in the community knows exactly where to go to get anything done. And I think that's a really wonderful model. It's a model that's happened throughout the years that we can really start to learn on and build on as becoming this sort of this sense of public place. The idea of lower operating costs. When you start to fragment your city government or your city services, you start to pay a lot more in rents and things around the city for actually operating these different buildings rather than having everything together and having that sort of synergistic relationship of all of these different functions. Potential revenue streams. What I'm talking about there is really sort of the spaces in between. It's very much like Don initially designed our civic center. It's about that space in between and what the importance of those spaces are and what they can mean to our communities. These are the spaces that can potentially actually be leased out, and you can actually gain revenue from those spaces. I've done city halls all up and down the state where we're actually taking and utilizing those public spaces, as I said, to get revenue for the city and to actually pay for things within the city itself. Oversight and control. Again, just a personal experience. I used to, my office now, we used to actually have our main office and then an annex across the street. And even though it was right across the street, both offices were run completely differently just because we had the luxury of sort of being on our own across the street in the annex. Well, you can imagine if you have a fragmented city hall and you've got Parks and Recs over here and planning over here, Public Works in another location, just the organization of that and how to actually start to operate that as a whole becomes very difficult. So the idea of having everybody together, I think, really is beneficial for the oversight and control of our community. Maximized efficiencies, I think that's rather obvious. When we start to overlay these sorts of civic functions, such as our libraries and our city halls and our community centers, you can actually start to borrow from each other. The open space, the common areas, all of that can start to relate to each other and borrow from one another, which I think really strengthens that whole community aspect of these projects. We talk about the more emotional aspects of a city hall. the whole idea of community engagement, bringing your community to that civic center. The civic center should be the place where, our parades start and stop. It should be where our communities come together as a whole. The whole idea of having a recognizable city center. I mean, Don did an amazing job of creating an icon for the city of Long Beach, especially at the time that it was built. I remember when I actually grew up in Orange County, and I had just gotten my driver's license when the city hall was under construction. Sorry, I'm a little older.
Another reference, yeah.
And I would drive all the way down Pacific Coast Highway just to look at the construction of City Hall, because I used to love downtown Long Beach just to come see it. And I remember sitting in my car and seeing that building and just being so impressed by just the monumentality of the building. It was inspiring to me as someone who wanted to be an architect to see what architecture can do for a skyline such as that. And I would love to see sort of a renaissance of this building, and really it brought back into the prominence that it once was. And then the whole idea of creating that civic landmark. I think this building does it better than just about any city hall I've seen in Southern California, as far as creating that idea of it being a landmark and an icon for our community. So the big question, if you're a fan of Tim Gunn, is how do we make this work? There's a lot of different ways we can actually take this building and start to really engage it and bring it to what our current sensibilities are. Dr. Lowenthal really started talking about this initially with the whole idea of community engagement. In the years that I've been doing this, it's always been that we've engaged the community for things like libraries and community centers. It's only very recently that we started to engage our communities for the design of city halls, which I think is really, really important, because a city hall is a public building. So I think one of the first big steps is tonight, actually, to start to engage our communities and bring them in and start to really listen to them about what the needs are for these public spaces. Secondly is reconceptualizing civic buildings as public buildings. That's something we're seeing up and down the state. We just recently completed the Malibu City Hall, where they've actually incorporated a performing arts theater, a dance studio, a senior center, and a community center, all within one building. And all of these spaces are borrowing from each other. So, there's one big set of bathrooms, there's one big lobby that can be transitioned from a performance venue to a city hall with just the closing of two large glass doors. So we're seeing that sort of synergistic relationship between uses that brings the community to that civic building. And encouraging, engaging cooperative planning around shared resources, which is actually just what I was talking about, among diverse institutions. This is called cooperative resource planning, where you're really starting to borrow from one another. So again, you're starting to cut down on your operating costs, maximize efficiencies, and bring the community together as a whole. So how do we pay for all this? For those of you, you got it. I was putting this in the slide presentation and no one knew who it was, but that's Jack Benny, who was notoriously cheap. So, how do we pay for all of this? Actually, just some of these strategies that I talked about tonight can actually start to pay for themselves. We talked about reduced expenses through consolidation and shared space. That's something we're seeing a lot of right now. I'm going to show you a project in just a little bit that we're working on for West Hollywood, where we're actually just redesigning, re-space planning their building, and we're actually being able to consolidate a lot of their off-site civic uses into the same building without actually having to build square footage. So you can imagine the amount of lower operating costs, the amount of rent they're not going to have to pay. That's actually what's going to pay for the reconstruction of the existing city hall. Increased revenues through outside leases, creation of rentable venue space, or promotional opportunities. Again, like with projects like Malibu, where they're actually charging a fee for the use of the Performing Arts Center. I'm going to show you a project in just a minute that we did for San Marcos that actually incorporated lease space into their original building. And what that did for them, it gave them an opportunity to expand and contract as they needed as a city. And then while that space sat vacant, it was actually leased out, and they actually gained revenue from that space. So it's all about how we sort of take that step back and we look at the big picture of how civic centers can be funded and how they can be operated. And lastly, Dr. Lowenthal started talking about public-private partnerships. And we are very fortunate in the fact that we do have one of the largest public-private partnerships in the state, happening just down the street here with the court building, which is an amazing project. We're actually looking at several different communities throughout Southern California right now that are looking at public-private partnerships for public buildings in cities like Lake Forest, in Artesia, in Malibu, places like that, where we're looking at these sort of joint partnerships with private entities that start to look at funding our public projects, which is really wonderful. The really great thing about these public-private partnerships, they often bring other elements to the equation that you wouldn't typically see in these public venues, such as retail, speculative office, entertainment, things like that that really start to enliven and engage our civic centers. So what I'd like to do in a similar nature to what Alan did, but I'm going to be kind of emphasizing a different thing, is start to talk about some similar projects that were built about the same time that are actually having similar situations currently. One project which the Long Beach Civic Center gets compared to a lot is the Boston Civic Center, our city hall, which is actually an amazing project, and at the time was actually named one of the great modern buildings that was built at that time. And it had a lot of the same praise as our Civic Center has, and it also has a lot of the same criticism that our Civic Center has. You want me to wait while you get that? Or? The really interesting thing is they have a mayor right now that for the last few years has been trying to get this building torn down, which is quite unfortunate. It does have a lot of problems, like our Civic Center, but I don't think there's any problems that can't be resolved. With the downturn in the economy, though, he's sort of gotten off of that now, and they actually initiated a competition to see what could be done with the existing City Hall, again, to bring it into our current sensibilities with regard to civic architecture. You see two of the design submittals here, which if you get a chance to go online and see some of these, they're absolutely amazing. Because what the whole thing is Alan mentioned it a little earlier, at the time, this architecture, the appropriate style for local government was to have this sort of monumental style of architecture. That's what everybody was doing. That's what was accepted. It was very fashionable at the time. And what people don't realize is that architecture is very subjective. It is very fashionable. We do have to kind of take a look at what we've done as architects, 50 years later, 75 years later, 100 years later, figure out how to make them relevant in today's sensibilities. I find it really sort of short-sighted to think that we can just throw away what we did in the past as not being relevant, because I think anything that we've done in the past can be looked at again and made very relevant. One story, which is a little bit smaller scale that I like to tell, is the story of building my own home. Me and my partner bought our house about 8 years ago, and it was the worst house on the best block in Long Beach here. And I remember standing out in front of the house, and we were starting to dismantle it. No intention of tearing the house down, but all the neighbors came around, and they were gathering around us, and they were saying, "Oh, you're going to tear it down? What are you going to build? 2-story Spanish, 3-story colonial? What are you going to do? What are you going to do?" And I was saying, no, we're going to keep it exactly as it is. And they all looked at us like we were crazy. What are you going to do with this thing? Because it was a pretty horrible looking little house. But 8 years later, we've been very fortunate. We added on only about 100 square feet to the footprint, kept the integrity of the original design. We've been very fortunate to have it published now 8 times, and it's been on the cover of 2 magazines. The one I'm most proud of is Environmental Design and Construction. So we took something that most people would just sort of throw away and made it something relevant. And I think that's something we can do with just about all of our buildings, especially buildings of this type, this importance, which I think the Civic Center actually is. And you can see it happening here in Boston. Another example, actually, Alan brought up is the Dallas City Hall by AIA, and something very interesting there over the years. They've had a lot of the same criticisms, the sort of austere monumentality of the building. And what they keep trying to do is kind of throw Band-Aids on it, which I think is very interesting. Instead of kind of taking a step back and looking holistically at the project, they keep trying to bring the public in sort of on a one-day basis. So you can see down in this picture here, they have this giant sort of formal water feature. And for one day in 1984, they brought in lifeguards and hot dog stands and created this sort of day at the beach, And everybody loved that because it sort of brought them to City Hall, and it gave the community a sense of togetherness and a being together. So they did that one day, and they never did it again, unfortunately. But they keep doing things like this. They keep bringing in art programs, and instead of kind of taking a step back and looking at, what's the big picture here? How can we see this building lasting another, 50 years, another 100 years, which I think it very well can. So it's again, and I think we're at a very good point right now where we can take that step back and look at our Civic Center and really determine what it can be. So again, it's about making these buildings work for today's sensibilities. I'm going to show you just real quick, and I know it's getting late, a couple case studies of a couple projects. And again, these projects aren't relevant to the Long Beach Civic Center because these are done specifically for their communities, much in the same way that the Long Beach Civic Center was done for ours. But there is a philosophy here that I think we can carry forward. What I chose was our oldest Civic Center, which is San Marcos, and our newest, which is West Hollywood. San Marcos was built about 12 years ago, and the whole idea there was this welcoming attitude towards civic government and city services. So this is the main entry to the City Hall. The project was comprised of a city hall, community center, library, performing arts center, public park, and it's been a wonderfully successful project. This is the community that actually integrated it's about 20,000 square feet of lease space, which is basically paid for the project since it's been built, which has been amazing. They also charge a revenue for the Performing Arts Center, which is nice, as well as some of the community rooms. They all share this public open space area in between, so all of the buildings benefit from that. They open this public open space up to things like festivals, art fairs, big civic events, community events, that sort of thing. So it's a really engaging project for the community. One of my favorite pieces, you see in this photograph over here, is this massive fireplace that's right in the center and the heart of the project. And what's really wonderful about that is you can go out there on a summer night and the Boy Scouts will be gathered around telling stories. It's used by the Girl Scouts. They have small performances out there. I've been out there where there's a string quartet playing. And it's just a wonderful way to sort of engage the community. But again, what they did to actually accomplish this is that integral lease space. That was key. And what Dr. Lowenthal started mentioning about all the opportunities around our Civic Center to start to engage other types of uses, whether they be civic uses or private uses, to start to engage this and make this really feel like a civic center. Again, this had the City Hall, Library, Community Center, Performing Arts Center, public open space, but the Civic Center was designed as a public destination. And Don mentioned a lot of that actually was inherent in the design of our our Civic Center that was really never realized. I think it's time to kind of take that step back and realize what this building was intended to be and really bring that to fruition. And then again, the whole idea of it being revenue generating, to actually have a Civic Center and a public place that actually makes money for the community is key. Next is a very, very different approach, which we're currently working on for the city of West Hollywood. Those of you who don't know, the City Hall was actually built in a speculative office building that had been converted on Santa Monica Boulevard. It was redesigned by Eller Reed Beckett about 20 years ago. And now they're just sort of busting at the seams just because it's really been planned poorly on the interior and they've grown in very odd ways. They have a parking lot in back of the City Hall, which actually only parks 62 cars, which is about a third of the code required parking for that building. So get this, their entire staff parks 2 blocks away in a city parking structure and walks to City Hall. And they do this in the rain and in the cold, and they're walking down the street with umbrellas. So it's very interesting to see when this whole staff is coming to work at the same time, all walking down the street holding umbrellas. Because what they have to try and do is keep those parking spaces as open as possible. The other thing that does is it takes that parking structure, which is a public parking structure, and basically by 11 o'clock every day it's completely full. So none of the local businesses can actually utilize that parking structure. So the city's actually losing revenue on their parking structure, which is a shame. Plus they can't even park their own constituents. So the main crux of the project was the development of what's known as an automated parking structure, which is the building in the foreground here. It's going to be, hopefully it'll be the second one in the state built, or the first one actually operational, the second one built. That's actually an automated parking system for your car. It's basically you pull in, you get out of your car, and the parking structure does all the rest. But what that's doing for us, it's actually taking a parking lot that held 62 cars, it's parking over 200 cars in the same spot. But the best part about that is what's left over. Again, it's those spaces in between. We actually now have the ability to create this public open space, this public plaza. You can see a couple images of what that might start to look like. And that's something that the city of West Hollywood has never had around their city hall. Right now it's basically asphalt up to a door, which is rather unceremonious to get into your city hall. The other thing that we're looking at now for the City Hall, as I mentioned earlier, was just different ways of planning the interiors of City Hall. So we're taking sort of antiquated planning systems and utilizing things like telecommuting, hoteling, benching systems, which is actually reducing their footprint for their individual departments. And that's enabling us to bring in some of the outside leases that they have and start to consolidate them within this one building. So they're able to actually drop off those leases, stop paying on those rents, and put all the money back into this existing City Hall. We're actually gaining so much room by doing this that we're able to incorporate additional community rooms within the City Hall building, which is really wonderful. But this plaza space, which is really key, is going to be sort of the center of civic activity within the community. It's a very kind of long, narrow, urban space, but it'll have a little stage in there, so they'll be able to use it for performances in the evening, for press conferences, things like that, for different events. We have designs where you can set up for a civic dinner, those sorts of things. There's going to be an amazing public art component. We're working with the international artist Ned Kahn right now to come up with an incredible art piece that'll be kinetic, that'll be part of the actual building. But the whole key to this really is that automated parking structure, because it's providing that space in that room. It's also providing that revenue. It's also providing the availability of that existing parking structure now for local businesses, as well as this parking structure. We're actually over parking this so that local businesses can use this during the day. Residents can use it at night for a very, very small fee. And all of the local restaurants, if you're familiar with that area, there's tons of restaurants around there that have absolutely no parking. So this will actually incorporate parking for those local businesses as well. So this is a project that the community right now is very supportive of, because they can see the benefits of for their actual community. But I think it's that open space, which is something that's really going to kind of set this off and really create that sense of civic center that they were looking for. So what this is really all about, and Alan mentioned it earlier, is the idea of placemaking, which is very, very important. That's, again, bringing in the public and really determining what the needs of the community are before you actually start designing that space. It's really about understanding the nature of the relationship between local government and the public with which it serves. And what people don't realize a lot is that good public spaces can promote health, happiness, and well-being. So with that, do we have the questions? Because I'd like to ask our panel. Laura? The lovely Laura Verbeek. Oh, there is? Sorry, I'm getting a preview here. Okay, I'm just going to start asking them. Do you have the IMPay design for the art museum, and is it possible to include this in a future plan? We actually had one image that Maureen had shared with us, and I wish we would have put it in the presentation, but unfortunately we did not. I don't know if there's any other drawings that exist on that, though.
Yeah, it's in, if anyone has the Long Beach Architecture book by Cara Mulio and Jennifer Bolan. They feature that photograph or a drawing or illustration of the Civic Center with the IMPay Museum there, and she talks about, you know, what he was trying to achieve and that type of thing. So it's a good source.
It's very interesting though, because he played off of the curved element that the amphitheater takes on in our current Civic Center. So it started to really stress more the organic nature of what Don had originally done, rather than the sort of orthogonal nature of what's there. So it was really a wonderful contrast.
It's nice to have a museum on Broadway rather than the face of a parking structure too, just from an architectural
One man's
standpoint.
opinion, yeah. The homeless population is entrenched. How will development of the downtown Civic Center be impacted? Who would like to take that? Oh, Lord.
Structural engineer.
They definitely did come here to listen to me respond to that one.
Well, I think I'll wing it if you want to join in, though. I think any time that you start to activate a place, you're going to see a very big change in how it's actually utilized. I think the more activity that we can bring here, the more of the community that we can bring here, you're going to see a change in the way that the space is actually used. And I think that's going to have a lot to do with it. I don't know if anybody wants to.
Well, program, Don talked about it, but programming, and you did too, Rick, I mean, programming is really critical in any kind of public space. And so how the uses that are around the site and the uses that are part and parcel of those public spaces will have an influence on how it's used by everyone.
I think if you would go back to the original concept for the amphitheater and actually have an amphitheater there that is used constantly, that would be a wonderful way to sort of activate that space. I know when I come to meetings at City Hall, you know, traversing across that plaza is sort of deadly. There's just nobody there, and you know, if there were tumbleweeds in Long Beach, I'm sure they'd be sort of tumbling across that plaza, just because there's no actual programmable functions happening there, which is really a shame because it could be a wonderful civic plaza.
I showed some pictures of the Oakland Museum, and I don't know if that's I think that's a public park that it's adjacent to, and Oakland is not a city that does not have a homeless problem, just like us, but because there's so much activity and programming that's going on in those spaces, I didn't see the same kind of problem that we have here.
Next, is there any thought to creating a symmetry between the revitalized Civic Center and Cal State Long Beach, which is at one end of the city, while the Civic Center is at the other end? That's a very interesting question. I have a feeling I know where that came from. Anybody?
I think it's too late. to really have without a major connection? Or do you just mean ideally, or you mean avenue-wise, and landscaping-wise, or communication, or transportation-wise, or, I don't,
They only rode on one side of the car.
homeless-wise, or?
I think there's definitely an opportunity to create a dialogue, whether or not there's an actual connection. I think the fact that you've done a lot of the buildings at Cal State Long Beach already starts that dialogue. It's just a matter of how do we emphasize that, how do we strengthen that dialogue, basically.
Maybe Cal State Long Beach can come and occupy part of that site. I'd love to see Cal State Long Beach actually in part of downtown, start to get away from the town, the gown, and be part of the town as well.
That's an incredibly good idea. How can the Civic Center be adjusted to discourage homeless from hanging out? I think we just mentioned that one. So. Could panelists weigh in on the people who use Civic Center? Politicians, children at the library, park goers, homeless people, dog walkers, etc., and how the hierarchy among them. I'm going to run to the bathroom. You guys.
Next.
Wow.
I'll address that a little bit. I don't know about hierarchy, but I do work occasionally at the main library as a substitute librarian, so I'm there. I also do, I'm at City Hall quite a bit for other activities. And I would say, at least coming into the main library, I see people either in the plaza or coming in from Lincoln Park. The dog park actually has activated quite a few of the residents that live downtown in the high rises or in those areas. They really use that park, and I know from personal experience that the usage of the main library has increased amazingly, especially in this economy. And so we're seeing all walks of life coming in there, and it's really almost like the New York subway system. It equalizes our hierarchy, for lack of a better word. People who are looking for jobs are, elbow to elbow with people who have jobs but are looking for reading material or needing assistance. So that is a function of a main library, and I can really only speak to that. But I think it's an opportunity to activate our city's downtown in a really positive manner.
Well, I would only say really quickly, I think it also goes to, it's really important as a city to understand how uses next to other uses impact each other. And if you look at the edges of let's say, Lincoln Park, and what the buildings are doing, you have a vacant state office building on one side, you have sort of a dead retail zone on the other, there's a loading dock in Landmark Square that faces City Hall. And those all take away from the vitality and the usefulness of that park. And the park itself has some problems because, like a lot of projects, it's really a park on top of a parking structure. And the problem with that is that those ramps cut off, again, that access. So I think some of it is, different people will use it with different urban design gestures that we can introduce into the future. And when we talk about Civic Center, we probably should expand beyond just the boundaries of the Civic Center and think about the adjacent streets and how they're going to be redeveloped over time as well, and what we'd like to see happen there.
And I love what Dr. Lowenthal was talking about bringing in other uses that you wouldn't typically see with the Civic Center, and really sort of expanding that footprint and really reaching out and creating that synergy that I think we need. I think this is the last question. It talks about what do you see specifically for the library. And I'll start with that one, and then I'm sure Maureen would want to jump in here. But it's funny because just recently we're seeing a lot of library renovations that were built around the same time as our library, as our main library. And the reason why we're seeing a lot of renovations is because, again, it was based on that time and what people saw as appropriate library design, which wasn't a lot of natural light, wasn't a lot of glass, wasn't a lot of openness. We do, fortunately, have a lot of natural light coming in from up above, but there is that sense that you're sort of bunkered in, and it's this very solid environment. I would love to see the library just really opened up, and I think there could be a lot more dialogue between the library and the open public spaces around it to sort of bring the outdoors in and really create that indoor-outdoor relationship, which we're seeing a lot in libraries right now. I mean, I would love to see a children's garden, which doesn't currently exist, something really vibrant that can be used on a daily basis, for story time and things like that. I think we can start to utilize a lot of those outdoor spaces to really engage our library and make it a really wonderful place. As an architect, when I walk into that building, the first time I remember walking, it literally took my breath away. Just the volumes and the massing of the interior spaces, I think, are really wonderful. And I think, like Alan said, it's as simple as a tweak here and there that could really make that a spectacular environment.
I don't really have anything to add with the future of the library. Yeah, I mean, that's for people much smarter than me to decide. Pardon? Visibility
Yes.
would be good.
That's
Yeah.
key.
That's our
Yeah.
biggest issue right now. People don't know what we are.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And that's so easy to resolve.
What it is.
Yep.
Yeah, so Darla is the manager of the main library. Wave your hand there. And then Francisco next to her is the head of the children's department. So.
And those things are just so easy. And again, as Alan said, they are tweaks to the design. It's not like we have to start from scratch. I love this next question. I meant to talk about this, but I did not. About generating revenue. What about installing solar and wind turbine systems via power purchase agreements in some of the open spaces on the library or around the library? I love these ideas, but I think the ultimate in sustainability is the reuse of this building and the reinterpretation and the reinvestment in this building. Rather than throwing it away, I think if we can really concentrate on how to make this great, which I think, again, is just a tweak away. I think overlaying the idea of solar and wind power. Wind power doesn't really work too well around here. We've tried to do that a lot of times, and we just don't seem to have enough of it. But solar power, I think, could be huge here. The parking structure that I showed you that we're doing currently for West Hollywood has an 11,000 square foot photovoltaic array on the roof of the parking structure, which is actually going to take that structure completely off grid and then supplement the power for City Hall. So that is so easy to do too, and there are amazing incentives out there right now to do things like this. So that's sort of a no-brainer. I would love to see actually studying this site because we are so close to the water. There might be an opportunity to actually do some wind turbines and things like that. We've done wind turbines a lot in Northern California, which work great. And they're almost a wonderful way to kind of bring animation to the site as well, where you can actually design these things as art pieces. There could be some amazing things too with water collection on this site, which I think could play a part in animation. And I meant actually collecting it and using it, not not pumping it out of the library. But to actually, again, I hate to keep bringing up West Hollywood, but we're actually incorporating on-site cisterns that are going to collect the water and actually use it to water all of the on-site landscaping. So I think that's something we could definitely start to look at for this site, which could be wonderful. So there's a lot of really amazing sustainable strategies out there that I think could really start to take this building and turn it into a building, for the next century, which could be wonderful. Was that it? Okay, really quickly, and then you guys can go. I just want to acknowledge a lot of people that had put in a lot of hard work tonight. Jonathan Glasgow, AIA, principal at Interstices. Laura Burbrick, she's the lovely lady that just brought down the cards. She's lead AP, BD plus C, an associate AIA, and between her and John, they were invaluable in putting this whole event together, and I really want to thank them for all their hard work. Maureen Neely, right here. Erin Lemaster, AIA, principal at Lemaster. Our sponsors, the American Institute of Architects, Long Beach South Bay Chapter, Long Beach Heritage, Anderson Real Estate Group, the Aquarium of the Pacific, thank you all very much, and then JMS. Our local contributors, Karen Clements, William Quicklow, Louise Ivers, Nancy Latimer, John Thomas, Brian Wilczewski, David White, and the Long Beach Public Library. Thank you all very much. We'd also like to invite you all to join us Wednesday, October 22nd at 7 p.m. right here at the aquarium for the Pine and Ocean re-envisioning. It'll be the sort of kickoff meeting for that process. So we hope you'll all be there. There's also going to be another presentation, sort of a public open house for the different design concepts that have already been explored for City Hall. We haven't gotten a date for that yet, but we're going to put that on the website, the AIA website, and you'll see where that's going to be. So I invite you all to join us there as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody very much for coming out tonight and for your passion for our community and our Civic Center. Thank you all very much.